There are days when I look at my life and ask myself why I always begin with determined energy, but end up in disappointment. Meanwhile, I see how the Japanese manage to move forward with discipline, calmness, and steady progress, as if they've discovered a secret the rest of the world hasn't understood yet. I tried to imitate them, training too hard, changing myself too radically, but after a few days, everything collapsed again. That feeling of helplessness kept returning, making me doubt myself. What tormented me the most wasn't that I hadn't changed yet, but that I couldn't understand why the very things that moved the Japanese forward every single day caused me to stall right from the beginning. And the surprising thing is, this failure was never really my fault. The reason wasn't my discipline, my motivation, or even my willpower. The real problem was hidden much deeper. While I was trying to change my life in one big leap, my own brain reacted as if I was putting it in danger. It resisted everything that was too radical, too fast, too much. And suddenly it became clear to me why the big plans always collapsed, while the tiny Japanese steps worked. It wasn't because of the strength of their will, but because their system embraces the human brain instead of fighting it. When I understood all of this, something fundamental shifted within me. For the first time, I no longer saw my repeated setbacks as signs that I was unmotivated or inconsistent. I realized that for years, I had been pressuring myself with methods that worked against my own biology. I had tried to run before I even knew how to stand securely. This thought brought an unexpected sense of relief. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe the path itself was wrong. The biggest aha moment came when I realized I didn't need more discipline. I needed a kind of change my body could accept. Not bigger, but smaller. Not louder, but quieter. The real enemy was never a lack of willpower, but the belief that change only matters when it's big. In reality, stability always begins with something small, and that's exactly what Kaizen makes possible. When I understood this, I stopped judging myself for my pace, and instead began to trust it. Before I understood how Kaizen truly works, I believed for a long time that change was an act of force. But the more I let go of that idea, the more clearly I saw that it isn't intensity that propels people in Japan forward. It's the structure with which they weave small steps into their daily lives. It isn't a spontaneous impulse or a brief burst of motivation, but a system that works quietly, day after day. And this system only began to make sense to me when I realized that it's not about reaching big goals, but about shaping them in a way that doesn't disrupt my inner balance. From that point on, a clear path opened up for me on how Kaizen is actually applied. Step 1. Reduce the goal to the smallest possible movement. The first step was so subtle I almost overlooked it. I had to shrink my goal until it triggered no resistance within me. 1 page instead of 10. 2 minutes of tidying instead of an hour. A brief moment of conscious breathing instead of a full meditation session. It felt unfamiliar because for years I believed change needed to feel big to be meaningful. But this is exactly where everything breaks. The brain only accepts what feels small enough to be safe. When I minimized the steps, I felt the blockage dissolve. I began without inner struggle, and that tiny beginning was stronger than any big attempt before. One of the biggest mistakes I kept making was believing that results had to become visible quickly. If I didn't feel a change after a few days, I lost patience and gave up, without realizing that Kaizen works in the unseen. The second mistake was trying to improve several areas at once. I wanted to be more productive, healthier, more disciplined, and calmer, all at the same time, and then wondered why my inner system was overwhelmed. Another mistake was underestimating the small steps. They seemed so insignificant that I often thought they were worthless, and by thinking that way, I destroyed their impact. And finally, I made the mistake of interpreting small interruptions as failure. Skipping one day immediately meant everything is ruined for me, even though Kaizen is designed precisely to cushion such moments. Only when I understood that consistency matters more than perfection did my daily life truly begin to change. The longer I walked this path, the more I realized that change doesn't mean being strong all the time. It means giving yourself space. You don't have to function perfectly, and you don't have to accomplish everything every day. It's enough if you find one small step today that feels right for you. It's normal to be tired. It's normal to pause. And it's normal that some days feel heavier than others. That doesn't take anything away from you. You are not broken because you move more slowly. You're simply learning, in a gentle way, how to work with your own rhythm. When you stop judging yourself for not doing everything immediately, a new space opens within you. A space where small steps are enough, where growth doesn't hurt, and where you finally begin to see yourself not as an obstacle, but as part of the path. Step 2. Create a daily trace that feels natural. Once the step was small enough, the next task was to repeat it daily until it naturally found its place in my routine. I linked these mini steps to clear moments: reading after breakfast, tidying up briefly before turning on my laptop, a conscious breath before leaving the house. They were tiny markers in my day, but they gave me structure. More and more, I felt my body begin to treat these actions as something natural. I no longer needed motivation because the routine itself became a calm, stable structure. It wasn't, "I have to do this," but rather, "This is part of who I am." Step 3. Increase the tiny improvement only when it's stable. Kaizen never demands immediate escalation. It waits until a step becomes easy, until it barely requires attention. Only then is it allowed to grow. I noticed this moment when one day I simply kept going without thinking about it. 1 page became 2, 2 minutes became 5. One conscious breath became a clear moment of calm. The growth didn't feel like something I had to force. It felt like a natural impulse from within. It was progress without pressure, without struggle, without constantly comparing myself to a perfect end goal, just a quiet continuation. The truth that shaped me the most was this: change doesn't fail because we do too little, but because we try to do too much too quickly. Kaizen reverses this principle. It shows that strength doesn't come from big leaps, but from tiny steps repeated so many times that they become part of who I am. And in that gentleness lies the power that makes the Japanese method so unique. Progress that isn't loud, but lasts. When I began to understand why big changes kept overwhelming me, I realized it wasn't my willpower that was the problem, but the way my brain responds to change. For the inner system, every radical step signals instability. As soon as something feels too big or too abrupt, the body unconsciously activates protective mechanisms. I suddenly felt tired, distracted, or nervous. And for a long time, I mistook these reactions for personal weakness without recognizing that they were biological. The brain loves familiarity. It moves comfortably within known patterns because they provide safety. Anything that breaks that frame is automatically registered as a potential threat, even if it's rationally beneficial. That's why big plans fail so often, not because they're wrong, but because they're too far from what the nervous system considers manageable. When I began studying Kaizen, I suddenly understood why the Japanese approach is so powerful. It doesn't force the mind to take a leap. It invites it to take a step so small it barely registers. A few minutes of tidying up the workspace, a short moment of focus, a tiny improvement that triggers no internal alarm and is therefore effortlessly repeatable. And it is precisely through this repetition that real change happens. Kaizen doesn't work with pressure, it works with gentleness. It respects the body's limits and uses them to its advantage. It shows that real growth doesn't come from explosive transformations, but from small adjustments that are stable enough to take root. And when I understood that, I realized the problem was never my discipline. The problem was the speed at which I tried to change. A speed my system was never ready to follow. When I understood how quietly and yet how powerfully small steps work, I began to see myself differently. No longer as someone who keeps trying to reorganize their life, but as someone capable of growing a little every single day. This perspective changed everything. I no longer needed to prove that I was strong. I only needed to prove that I was willing to keep going, even if it was slow. And perhaps that is the most important realization. You are not someone desperately trying to become better. You are someone who has the ability to continuously evolve, quietly, steadily, and in your own rhythm. If you want this journey to continue, walk with me. We can grow step by step, one day at a time.